Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our series for building community capacity for change in a crisis. Today, we are privileged to be going over you have an equity plan. Now what? I want to, before we continue, just give a few more seconds just to let people fill in, so no one's missing any of the great action we have planned for today. If you've been with us for the previous 3 webinars, thank you very much, and thank you for coming back. You must be doing something right, so that's good to know. If you're a first-time visitor, thank you for coming, and we have I think about 3 more webinars after this, so please check those out. Okay. So my name is Daniel Pagan, and I'll be kind of opening up the webinar today along with my colleague Amber Trout, and she's also joined, here we go, also joined by 2 panelists today. We have Robin Johnson and Steve Nakana, who will be providing their perspectives during the discussion. I'll ahead of myself there on the slides. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping for those who may be new to GoToWebinar. Everyone, as you join, will be muted. Participants will all be muted. But we do really encourage you to submit your questions or comments through the questions panel throughout the webinar. I'll be kind of monitoring those, and we'll have a bit of time towards the end of the discussion to answer some of those questions. And as well, the webinar will be recorded and shared back to all registrants, attendees in a couple of days after the webinar has ended. We'll also be sending out some resources along with that. During the webinar, you can download the bios of our panelists, as well as the PowerPoint slides, or the PowerPoint of the slides if you want to follow along with us. Those will only be, you can only access those during the webinar, so feel free to get those in the handouts panel. And finally, if you are having any technical issues, maybe you can't hear or you can't see, or just having general questions about GoToWebinar, please send your emails and questions over to our other colleague, Evelyn. Her email is right here at the bottom. And before I continue, now that I've introduced myself and Amber and briefly the panelists, I'd like to just kind of get a sense of who is on today. Our poll will come up. So yeah, if you all can just take a second to answer kind of what brings you here today, what's your primary role in your community organization, and we'll just give a few seconds for people to work through that. And really just pick whichever answer best picks or best represents what brings you here today. No right or wrong answer in this scenario. Looks like so far we have a pretty even crowd, which is pretty cut right across. Let's see. Okay. All right. Let's see. What we see here is a pretty even cut right across the categories here. A little more people as researchers, consultants, but still a pretty good representation of everyone. So welcome. Moving back through. Okay, so today Amber will be kind of framing up how equity plans and equity strategies really can be tools for culture shift that will help to actually close the gaps in racial and economic disparities. She'll frame this up as well as kick off the discussion with the panelists, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. And with that, I'll actually transfer it over to Amber.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Before we get started, I know certainly Steve, Robin, and Daniel and I, when we were preparing for this webinar, there's just so much going on that it really is like a compression. And we just want to take this minute to just acknowledge the unjust death of George Floyd, who died in custody of the police with a white police officer putting a knee on his neck, and just like taking this space to take a collective breath. There was the video of the white woman weaponizing her privilege in New York against Christian Cooper, putting his life at risk. And it's just a lot. And so we just wanted to start off this space, just taking a collective breath and honoring this is what's going on around us as we have this conversation about equity plans, but to also honor where we are. For some, it might be looking around the room, just kind of seeing your environment, because it is a lot to take in, or just a gentle touch to yourself. But we just felt it was critical to just be here. Steve or Robin, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say at this moment.
I'll just add, I appreciate the creating of space and the creating a moment of honoring our communities and the lives that are impacted. And as a multiracial woman who identifies as Black, I know that for me, moments like these where there's a heightened awareness of the level of violence directed towards Black lives and Black communities in particular, not exclusively, but in this moment in particular, it weighs heavily on me. And I find myself fatigued and dragging. And in that, I also find myself remembering how critical this work is. And that as in the same vein of it's not enough to say I'm not racist, we actually need to be actively anti-racist in all the work that we're doing. Similarly, I have a real feeling and a commitment around, we can't just say we're organizations committed to advancing equity. We need direction, we need strategy, we need focus. And so I feel like in some ways, as much as I'm balancing between my weariness and my commitment to the work, in some ways this webinar is really timely. And I'm just really thankful for you all creating the space for us to honor our community members who have been lost. So thank you.
Well, this also brings hopefulness, and I just appreciate that, Robin, is the duality of that. What makes me hopeful is this conversation, and that organizations are units of change that we can leverage to address the historic and the current racial and economic disparities that are still occurring through the different practices we do. And it's just not enough to have awareness. So it's exciting to see there's more organizations doing training on bias, structural racism, white culture, dominant culture. We even saw in the Chronicles of Philanthropy a call for chief equity officers. So the position of equity has influence and power over an organization. And yet we know that's not enough. And an equity plan is not enough too. Because what we hope is, how does that equity plan go to action? And we know there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of resources out there on how to get to the equity plan, right? And case studies on it. And the purpose of this webinar putting together is what happens after you have your equity plan. You have it, but now you have to then start implementing it and getting those strategies to action, to getting that change you want to see in your community, and also with your staff or individuals that your organization might touch. So we don't know all the answers. We don't know if there's one strategy or there isn't one strategy that everyone must do to close this racial and economic gap. But we're here to just offer key strategies that we know organizations have used, as Robin said, to take the equity plan, have it focused in strategies to take action in the communities. So I just wanted to invite the panelists, if you don't mind just saying a little bit about yourself, your organization's equity journey, and a main or key issue areas you'd like to offer for us to consider for this webinar. Robin, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. It's morning here for me, so good morning, everyone. I'm Robin Johnson. I am currently with Umpqua Bank, which is a West Coast bank that covers a 5-state region. So we cover Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and California is where we have our stores. And I have been with Umpqua Bank. It just is coming up on 4 months. And where would I say we are in our journey? We are in a place where we have some strategies that have been developed. We have some really powerful and engaged, we call them associate resource groups. We have 3 currently, where I'm hoping to be able to expand that this year, and COVID-19 definitely impacted the rollout of some of those, but they're still slated to start later this year, bringing in some culturally specific ARGs, and then additionally one for differently abled folks. And I would say in some ways, with me coming in, my predecessor had done an amazing amount of work, really laying the foreground for me to come in. And I also think at the same time, there's always an opportunity when a new person steps into a role to do a bit of a reset. So at the moment, I'm doing a gap analysis, and I'm using, let me write this down because I promised to share resources with you all. The Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, the GDIB, which is pulled together by the Center for Global Inclusion. They're a really great organization. They do international work around DEI, and their assessment has really afforded me the opportunity to dig deep into 4 main pillars. Again, I'll share out the resource so you all can access it. So I'm in this place where I'm in the mix of kind of weeding through and sorting through strategies that have already been developed, figuring out what's relevant, how to prioritize, etc. And at the same time doing a gap analysis and figuring out where are the gaps, what's missing, and given in the banking industry, what are some really low-hanging fruit, and at the same time, what are some really some areas where we need to attend to sooner rather than later. So that's a bit of our journey. I'll say before I was with the bank, I was with the Center for Equity and Inclusion, also based out here in Portland, Oregon. And before that, I was with the governor's office, Governor Kate Brown in Oregon, as her inclusion policy advisor.
Thank you, Robin. Steve,
Yeah.
do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, your journey,
Yes.
and some key issues for us to think about for the webinar?
Absolutely. My journey. Okay, right now I'm the Port of Portland Social Equity Program Manager, and I just made 4 years at the port, and I have a wild, crazy journey to get to the port. And so just talk a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Cape Town, South Africa, but I was born in Lusaka, Zambia, and I went to school on 3 continents. I've worked in the nonprofit world, and worked in the nonprofit world, and my work used to take me internationally. And I, prior to joining the port, actually here locally in Portland, when I moved to the US, I worked at an organization called Mercy Corps, the global humanitarian organization that operates in about 40 countries. And I used to do conflict resolution programming for them around the world. And I've also been an adjunct professor at PSU. And after I left Mercy Corps, I joined the Port of Portland. as I said, 4 years ago. And at that time, when I started, equity, diversity, and inclusion were beginning to be topics at the port. And you'll notice that I say equity here and diversity and inclusion, and I will explain a bit further why I'm making that distinction with the work. So when I started at the port is an interesting organization here in Portland, Oregon. We are our own special district, and we run the, which is regarded as the best airport in the country. We've won awards. It's like Robin is like, it's like, yeah, we have a carpet, it's national. So it's the best airport in the country, and we own marine terminals, and we also are involved in industrial land development. What that means basically, the port sometimes buys and sell land so that we can help with job creation and to bring companies to work locally. And so, we are really rhizomically embedded in the socio-economic environment of Oregon. So we have got environmental impacts, we have economic impacts, and we have social impacts. So one of the biggest projects that the port undertaken was cleaning up of an old aluminium plant in an area of Oregon which is called Grisham. And so when the port decided to clean that brownfield, one of the things that they wanted to really get a handle on was, how do we make sure that as the organization cleans up this brownfield, we are not going to perpetuate the legacies of the past. We're going to create new jobs, good jobs for folks, and our environmental impact will be mitigated as best as possible, but also that access to whether it's transportation and jobs will be equitably accessible to everybody that lives within that area. So basically, the cleanup of that brownfield was on 3 pillars: environmental stewardship, economic development, and equity. And they did it. But one of the things that they realized after that is that they couldn't actually measure the equitable impacts post cleanup. And there were also some things that were going on in other areas where the port was being really asked to think through carefully how to become an equitable and inclusive place and to actually have a program. And so the port went out and brought in consultants, one to advise them on best practices around equity, and another one to advise them on how to actually do diversity and inclusion work. And so I was hired 4 years ago to try and, do equity work. And then they also hired a diversity and inclusion manager. And so my role when I started, and this is basically what I'm going to be talking about today, was because I was involved in program design. I was like, yeah, you are not ready for diversity and inclusion work. You first have to create a program so that you can actually begin to do diversity and inclusion work. But we already had a diversity and inclusion program manager that they had hired actually before I started. And so we went through an organizational reorg to create a diversity and inclusion program and office from the ground up, bringing our kind of skills together, because prior to this, like some of our diversity work was in finance, some was in environmental, some was in HR, and some was in community affairs. And so part of my job was to tell the port that this is actually a discipline and it's a profession. It needs its own office and organization to be able to do the work. Thank you.
One thing I love about your story, Stephen, is just the need. What's the difference between deploying on a strategy versus building the organization capacity? And when that need was sought out in the brownfield, how a structure actually started shifting in your organization to better meet that need. And so when I was thinking about when we were preparing for this webinar, first, it was like, what does that journey look like? There's a lot of frameworks out there. And Daniel, do you mind shifting the slide for me? There's a lot of frameworks out there to how do you do an assessment. I really appreciate Robin honoring that it's a continual journey. Bringing in a new person is a new opportunity to bring in new eyes, an opportunity to see what other gaps weren't there. And really, a lot of the frameworks could be put in 3 buckets. And often on, let's see, my right lower side, there's the heart and mind work, right? We're staff and your leadership is given the space to hear concepts about structural racism. How would you do an analysis? What does white supremacy mean versus dominant culture? And it's just a time to reflect and understand, like, what can our organization do? What do we want to focus on? And so the heart and mind circle is really your why. Why are you doing this work? So like in Stephen's story, why? Because there was an impact to when there's environmental remediation, right? There's a economic and social impact. With Robin's work, it's like, what's the accessibility to the bank? What is the why to why we're doing the different trainings? The other buckets is then there's structures and that need to shift. So for some, it could be policies, like your hiring policies, to have our decisions made, and how do we do this work together. But really on my left-hand side, this is the what. What are we going to focus on? And then up top is the culture and behavior change. Often in frameworks, it's referred to as the values of the organization or the social norms. But this is your why. This is your how we're going to do it. How are we going to work together across difference? How are we going to think differently to do more equitable, informed strategies? How are we going to engage in conflict? It's going to happen. We have different understandings of what equity is, racial equity, inclusion, diversity. How are we going to deepen our relationships? And oftentimes in this framework, we've seen that organizations really get stuck on the heart and mind work, and you're attached to everyone has to believe the framework immediately. Instead of a journey, and that it's nurturing how do we have a critical lens, but also giving ourselves time to process. We also see organizations from the training and the program, you have your why and you know your what's. There's not enough time to tend to how are we going to do this work together to make that we, right? How are we going to do it? How are we going to have multiple perspectives and start breaking down the silos of the individual or just this one equity person? Oh, Steve, you just go do the work and let us know. And when you're balancing these three frameworks, you start to see a shift in the way the organization does business. And some even say the identity of the organization and how they do their work, relate and interact with staff and their community. Do you mind shifting to the next slide, Daniel? Thanks. But like Steve and Robin, there's a lot of work to get to that equity plan. And so you're holding a lot and it's exhausting work. You're worried about external structural racism. You're building your political will with leaders and staff. You have internal dynamics and forces like this is how we've always done the work. What are we gonna do? What if it doesn't work? You're trying to understand which framework works for my organization. Anti-Black framework, anti-racist, multicultural organization. Just a lot of information is coming at you. We heard Robin speak to employment resource groups, which has also been referred to affinity groups that you could do by race, you could do by other identities such as sexual orientation or religion. And then you're also trying to navigate how staff are responding to the equity plan and how staff were interacting with each other. So you're holding all this stuff. Meanwhile, as you're running forward, you have this undercurrent saying, are you sure? Wait, what does race mean again? What is racism? And then you finally cross this line. You're like, whew, I made it. We did it. We have our plan. We have a sharp critical lens. We know like there's racism, there's oppression, there's sexism. And then there's this path, right? And you're driving up this path and the image is gonna come as I keep moving my head like a snake. And you go up this path and you're like at the top and you think you're there, right? You know, when you're driving, you see the horizon of a mountain, you could see the sun and you're driving and you make that edge and you're exhausted. And then you open your eyes and you realize, when I move to the next slide, you realize, oh man, now this equity plan has to interact with the organization, which is a living system that has functions that have been in place a lot longer than your organization. Functions such as leadership and staff, decision-making processes, governance, accounting, different systems, right? And so that's that circle that's called function, right? And then you have the intrapersonal, like how your staff leadership just perceive the world before your equity plan. And the interpersonal, how people were interacting across with each other. This is before your equity plan. This is all going. So you have your equity plan and now your living system. And what we want to talk about today is what happens, that implementation is when you're bringing them together and you're finding that internal alignment. And what capacity is needed to have that equity plan become part of the fiber of each function of your organization, tending to the different dynamics from the personal to between groups, between departments. And oftentimes we see there's an internal team supporting the chief equity officer. In our world on this slide, we're calling it a chief equity officer because it's important that this person has power and influence and connected to the CEO and the board to be able to say we need power and influence so that we can improve the lives of this community because we want to address this gap in education or access to jobs. But it's really important to understand what happens at this meeting of the two. And this is where the stutter step in the description of the webinar we talk about, or there's a renegotiation. Because although you have your equity lens around your living organization, which is this yellow circle, you find when you start interacting that the equity lens is actually at the edge of the blue circles too. And you didn't think about that. And then, oh, when they cross, there's different layers. I was going to say to the onion, I have Shrek in my head, but there's different layers and nuances you didn't think about before because now you're in the system doing the work. In the meantime, you still have external systems happening like today that is trying to counter all the work you're doing. And so really the purpose of this image is to say, like, there's a lot of work that happens just to get to your equity plan. And that's a lot of effort. And then to integrate that with your organization, to go from equity plan to an effective organization, closing racial and economic disparities takes a lot of work, and it's tending to each one of these functions in your organization. So I just wanted to open up to the panelists and ask, like, what capacities or internal structures have you tended to or started to create in your organization to bring that equity plan into the organization as a living fiber?
I can start off if you don't mind, Robin.
No, that's great, please.
Okay. So here's how I first started, and this is why I mentioned the idea of programs. So I take a very kind of like, you know, if you're, for example, an engineer project manager, an engineering project manager believe in, you know, like they have this idea of a project or program life cycle. So I knew that because this work is about dismantling inequities that are produced by systems, and those systems are created by people, and people make decisions. And we are an organization that just occupies a small sector of what I would call, you know, like our political economy here in Oregon, right? Like our social situation. The Port of Portland, even though we have a broad impact, we're kind of like a small agency. So one of the things that I kind of thought about, and which I also had to educate my organization is, as I indicated, is I was going to build you a program. And for me to build your program, we are going to go through multiple phases, right? We're going to go through a conceptualization phase. That conceptualization phase basically will be to design the program, and it will include us figuring out And this is why I loved what Robin indicated. The global diversity benchmarks, those ones, I say, if you are just beginning to this work, take a look at that, because it can help you to think through before you actually begin to do the work, you know, how ready is your organization, right? Because your organization is not ready to do equity or diversity and inclusion, right? So you, as the person charged with doing this work, you have to build the foundation for the organization to do the work. However, though, your leadership is going to be looking for results. They'll be saying, these things are happening. When are people gonna be showing, you know, how inclusive are we gonna, how are we gonna get there? So part of you as a program manager or project manager, depending on what your title will be how do you actually measure your performance so that you can show your return on investment to your managers to say, if we build a program, here are my 3 goals or 4 goals, and I will advise you to limit them to 3. Here are my goals and here are the outcomes. Here are the strategies that we are gonna get into. And then here are the metrics that I'm gonna use to measure my performance so I can show you the work that I'm doing. And here's the performance that I'm gonna show you that I'm moving the organization towards, right? And then if we do this, and I'll kid you not, I'm 4 years now, just the conceptualization phase in the program design might take you 2 to 3 years. And you have to constantly communicate that to your leadership, because your leadership will be saying, why don't we go train our folks? To me, a training should be part of the outcomes that you're going to achieve once you've created your program. So it's part of the project of a program, and it should come later. So if you want to train folks, then maybe you need to be training folks for part of program design on how do you actually get an organization ready to begin the journey of designing the program, right? Because you are not ready to do any of these organizational effectiveness yet until you have designed a program with clear goals, outcomes, and metrics of how that program is going to measure itself in doing the organizational work, and also you having an idea on how you even going to measure yourself in doing the work, because you're going to have to prove your effectiveness to your leadership to indicate to them that you are actually doing the work, so that if the work is done, the program is there and the program is doing the work, then let's now talk about how different organizations, right? And I mean, how different departments and functions and those people working in the organizations are making those decisions, right, with equity, diversity, and inclusion in mind. So that if I'm in HR, I'm going to do hiring, I can actually make a link between equitable outcomes if we are going to be hiring from all over our state, right? Whether it is in Northeast Portland or Northeast Portland, like HR needs to know that if I can hire a person from a fast gentrifying community, maybe they might be able to continue living there, and they will keep their home and they'll keep their community, right? And HR needs to know that they've actually got an economic development decision that they make because of their HR practices. And if I'm in community affairs, I'm able to draw a link that if we have designed, you know, if my organization has all these projects that impact people of color, who do we bring to the table? And when we bring to the table, what kind of voice do they have? Do they even participate in the writing of those requests for proposals? That will determine what kind of benefits that project will go. Before you get there, you actually gotta build the program that can help to contain the work, right? And so for me, this is what I did when I first started. And I said, here is what I'm gonna do for you, Port of Portland. In the first 2 to 3 years, I'm gonna build you a program. Here are the outcomes of the program. Here are the strategies that I'm gonna get into. And guess what? Let's try to do training later. But we ended up doing training a year early because we really wanted to move the organization. Now, in my organization, 40% of our employees, we are 800 strong. 40% of people attended the training. Some people loved the training and some people hated the training. And so to me, then what that indicated to me is, if you are going to do training, before your program, you have to ask yourself questions. What is the point of the training and what do you want the training to achieve? Because you are not going to achieve equity and inclusion by having a 2-week training.
You just dropped a lot of knowledge, Steve, and I appreciate what you're saying, like with the program, meaning that like that foundation, that why are you doing the work, and bringing in that readiness tool to understand like where, like concretely, where can the Port of Oregon do work and link. Often like the concept's very abstract, and so what I appreciate you're saying is like you could have a critical lens, but you also have to have like the duality of like, but what could be alternatives? And we don't often have a lot of time to think, what if not this situation, what is another way to do it? And the power of the tool both of you are referring to at the global inclusion benchmarks, it helps show where you are, but also imagine where you could go. And then now what I'm hearing you saying, that is your internal structure, your tool to call in different departments so they can see themselves like deeply connected to the community, how HR can actually have an impact in the community of Portland, where it's gentrifying and there's racial and economic disparities happening as a result. So just the communication I'm also hearing is really critical, how to make sure it's clear and people understand what actions they can take, right, by knowing this knowledge. Robin, I just wanted to check in. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
I want to agree with everything that Steve said. I think the only, I want to make sure we get to other topics. So I'll just add really quickly that I have found that one of the best ways to get leadership engagement is to have the milestones and benchmarks tied to their performance. And so whether that means that's showing up in their strategies and what they're expected to execute on, it can take a lot of different forms, but that has been one of the key ways where instead of it just being kind of a one-way feedback loop where I'm reporting to leadership about the progress we're making, it's a more circular one in which I'm reporting out, but they're also sharing with me how they've moved the dial on their different departments and in their different areas, and that's informing and feeding into where the milestones are progressing. So that's all I'll add.
And that's that ownership, that collective ownership, instead of just putting the responsibility on the one person with the title of equity manager or director. Did you do you want to share about the capacities that you're building in your organization?
I can say that I think that I have a really strong, what I would say, a coalition of the willing, especially with the associate resource groups. It's a really, and their members, a lot of great energy and effort there. One of the gaps I'm recognizing is there's not necessarily the group who can move forward strategy, meaning that they have power and influence in their department to actually take, let's say, a DEI recruitment and retention policy and actually not just create it or have the abstract idea, but to actually implement it, to track it for change. So that's what I'm working on right now, is bridging between this coalition of the willing and the actual folks who are within these departments. And not to say that the folks who are in the departments who can move the policies aren't willing. It just, I have such a great energy group here, and I was noticing that there needs to be a little bit of bridging. And there's going to be, even in the concentric circle idea of places of crossover where these two different teams will be working and collaborating together while also focusing on their own scopes of work. So that's what it's looking like on my end.
We had a question from one of the audience members. It's a new friend or an old friend that's joining us today, but really asking what happens when you have that coalition of the willing, or you have staff that are excited and moving faster than your leadership. Is that a challenge that you've experienced, and how have you navigated that?
I have navigated it mostly through some some pretty frank conversations around the need for leadership engagement. And I will say that as I'm reflecting on that kind of strategy, I won't say that I haven't had that opportunity at Umpqua yet, but in other places where I've been, whether consulting or working, it comes down to a pretty frank conversation with leadership. And sometimes that's better navigated one-on-one with different people who are on an executive team before announcing that at the larger general, because it allows for some vulnerability, transparency, and honest dialogue, and then calling the group together and say, okay, great, I've gotten a pulse check from multiple executive team members. It sounds like we're willing to move in the direction of meeting the energy of the coalition of the willing, and we're willing to go there. Now let's figure out the strategy. And oftentimes I find that folks don't know what to do. And oftentimes with equity and inclusion, people are so fearful of the wrong misstep. You know, this is where we see whiteness coming in, perfectionism, what have you. And it ends up being such a barrier. And I think this is also connected to when we hire people within a company, we expect them to know their business. Like if you are hiring an HR professional, you expect them to know their business, how to be, you know, a recruiter or a talent management person. That's the expectation. And with DEI, we're so often exploring the unknown, especially if we're seeking true justice within an organization, just because we've not had that really in our country. So we're imagining something that hasn't been tested. That makes folks, especially on leadership teams, feel extremely uncomfortable. And so how do you meet even that energy of we're going to explore the unknown together, and how do we step up in that commitment? So that's often been my strategy, and it's been pretty well met. Oftentimes if it's too abstract or vague of an idea of, hey, we need your energy to match the energy of the other group, it can feel like a disconnect. And again, more like, well, what are we actually talking about here? So really getting down to, I think the phrase is brass tacks is really helpful. And I think it helps to build rapport and trust, especially if you're the person like Steve and I might be, where we're charged with carrying the work forward. You're often that bridge person and that bridge voice to have to support both an understanding. And I will say on the side of managing the energy of the coalition of the willing, there's some honest conversations that need to be had there as well, and how to kind of temper the energy with strategy and intention and purposefulness.
It makes me think of a question like, I didn't realize, I hear a lot, like, I didn't realize this is what equity work was going to look like when I got into it. Yeah. And it really is like organizing and navigating the multiple perspectives. And what I appreciate you saying, Robin, is like honoring that leaders are people too, and they have anxieties. And so giving them a chance to personally respond and think through the material, and then giving them the opportunity. What I hear you saying is like, how do you want to lead in this moment? Are we still doing this? And so that navigation and helping the communication going through is also critical of building that capacity of the we and the relational side of this work that is so necessary when taking the strategies on the paper, the concreteness, but the making it come to life is really dependent on the relationships and being able to communicate to each other. Stephen, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, so, and this strategy that I followed basically was, because, I mean, again, I told you about that program life cycle. So I had like the conceptualization phase, I had the implementation phase, and then I had the evaluation phase, and, you know, it was almost a loop. So in the conceptualization phase, I also kind of analyzed where my people that were willing at the port to take this work, and some folks had already started this work. And so because we're talking about equity plans, and because to me, once the program is created, one of the outcomes of the creating that programs basically was we were going to get engaged in actually creating equity plan. So the DEI, what I call the meta plan, which was just, to me, this is my work. And then we need to create a plan for the program, and then mini sub-plans for each department to get involved in, so that we can work towards a single set of of program goals, which are my goals, so that we can contain what each and everybody is going to be doing. And I can almost sit using a panopticon lens to say, that's what engineering is doing, that's what HR is doing, but they're all doing their own work, but that work is reflecting here. And so what I did is I took those folks that were willing and I said, I need you, and I created the training man. It's like, I need you to go through this training on how to create a project plan. And here's how you do a project plan. And the project plan needs to have at least 3 goals, 3 outcomes, strategies, metrics, and those metrics have to be smart, right? Because you're going to take this project plan and it follows a logical framework. You are going to train those people on how to do this so that if they're going to identify what kind of training they need, we need to be able to deliver that training if what they want to do is to have training delivered, right? And so that then becomes part of your program design work. And then those people that just think, oh yeah, to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work is to sit down and talk. No, it's like, but you gotta move the system, right? And this is how I also created accountability, because people now were like, oh, so you mean my department is gonna have a plan, but we don't do action plans. Like, well, you're gonna have to do action plan, because I need to know what you are doing as a department. There's almost like 7 different, we call them divisions and departments. So I got my coalition of the willing and I facilitated the training. And so they took the big program outcomes and strategies and goals, and and here's how we actually did it. So I trained them, and then I went to each and every department. I said, for you to create your departmental plan, you need to identify 2 community stakeholders. We're gonna have a workshop with them. Then they're gonna sit in as you develop your mini plan, and your mini plan's goals reflect this plan, the program plan, and it has 3 goals and outcomes. So for each outcome, you are gonna have 3 goals. So we had 1, like, how are we gonna work externally, how are we going to work internally, and how are we going to work within our community? So you need to give me ideas based on how you do your work. So if you are in HR, how do you do recruitment? How do you work as a team? How do you engage folks outside? So you tell me how you work, right? And then those people that were coalition of the willing help to facilitate that conversation so that we can link to even to the mission of the organization. And then I use that mini plan now, one way of not just holding people within that department accountable, but it goes all the way to the executive team. And so every year, we actually go to commission to present the progress that we are making. And every quarter, right, I go to present to the executive team about where each department is in implementing their equity plan. And guess what? The executive team, because those plans are coming from their department, they actually have to hear from their department what they're doing to meeting the PAUSE program plan, right? And every 3rd year, I say we're gonna bring in an external evaluator to check how we are doing on these 3 goals, right? And this is why I indicated from the beginning that if you are tasked in doing this work and your title is program manager, you first have to understand what is the discipline around project management or program management vis-a-vis DEI work, especially if you've never had this work in an organization. Because you basically, as Robin indicated, you are being asked to move an organization into an environment that it's never been, and nobody knows how that looks like. So you almost have to develop a vision in terms of outcomes, and then you've got to pull everybody towards you, right? Once you can create that, I'm telling you right now, we have a lot of work to do at the Port of Portland, but now people are even writing equity stories about what they're doing. And sometimes I don't even have acting. It's like I just go to our internal and it's like, oh, somebody wrote about this. I'm like, okay, let me follow up. Tell me how you got here. Right? It's like, it is really amazing to see what people are doing, including people in engineering, where they'll be like, I don't do equity work. Now they call me to sit down during their project, get reviews to say, Steve, we are going to change our HVAC system. what are the equity goals with changing HVAC system? And I'm like, thank you, you asked, right? So imagine HVAC and equity. 4 years ago, the engineering folks would be like, what are you smoking? I don't see the relationship between equity and changing air systems, right?
What I feel like I'm hearing you say in your share is that your capacity was having each function, each division in your organization create their own plan and generate themselves like how they see they can push equity and what is something they can achieve in a year or 2 years. And your role is it to advise? Is it to also provide feedback on it? So I'm trying to like parse out what does it start looking, what does your organization feel like? Yeah.
Now this is how it's looking like, but I had to design the vision. I had to design the strategies and had to do it in terms of outcome and to follow almost like a logical framework where I constantly asked myself, like, here are my assumptions doing this work. If I do X, Y, Z, would these be the outcomes that I'm gonna get? That's on you as the program manager for this work. So for example, if you say you are going to introduce training, you are making an assumption that that training is going to produce outputs that include an inclusive and welcoming place. Like, well, we did training, yeah, 40% attended, maybe 20 or 30% of those folks hated the training, right? So was it big, so did that training really produce the outcomes that I was looking for? So you constantly have to ask almost like that theory of change question. So what I did is you provide a vision, stick to the vision, but in creating that vision, that's where you also, like, you have professionals out there, and lucky enough here in Portland, that at the city of Portland, that I already started this work like 8 years ago at Multnomah County, and I did my own investigations outside to say, hey, how do you design a program? Forget about the work. How do you design a program, right? And so I was like hearing things, but I also used to design conflict resolution programs around the world and say, okay, here's how I'm going to design this program. And I remember when I started 4 years ago and I presented to my executive team, they were like, what's he talking about, program and outcomes and strategies? But they kind of needed the work, they trusted it. Now people are like, oh yeah, we're not even talking about the outcomes anymore. Like, I even get surprised. People say like, yeah, we're going for goal 1, we are going for goal 2, this is goal 3. When I started 4 years ago, people was like, prosperity and HR, like, how does HR produce prosperity in the community, right? Now people can actually make the link to say, hey, if we even gonna hire interns, let's think clearly about where those interns are coming from, because we are going to contribute to the economy of that community, right? And this is HR making those decisions. I don't even have to be there anymore.
I think there's an important finding that we're lifting up here is understanding the direction you want your equity plan or your equity vision. And one, we've been calling it the stutter step or negotiation, is to understand a training. Coming out of that training, is it going to then tell you, here's the actions we need to take? The training is part of the growth to expand how you see the world and how to think about different perspectives and have the same analysis. So like in Steve's story, like every department is thinking of the same set of questions, like who's impacted by this decision? How are communities of color impacted by this decision? So really, it's important to say, like, why are we doing this work, and having a program around it, or some organizations have called it an initiative, but we're saying it's not enough just to do the training and hope people will take these actions. Because as Robin was saying, it's a new world to think about what would it look like to do our work differently. And that takes a person or a team to have time on task saying, have you thought about this? Or if we fail, like what happens? So I just also want to name, we have a lot of terms floating around. So we've said the coalition of the willing. And for some, that just means your people, your staff that are bought in like understand and already like, yes, I want to do equity work, and they're excited about it. Some might have the skill set or understand the steps to do how to advance like equity in your organization, and some just might be excited and they're looking to you as the program officer or manager on how to deepen it in their department, as Steve is describing. We also talked about the word whiteness. That concept is also referred to a behavior, right? And how we interact, and that it's also the word dominant culture gets used a lot, or white culture, and they're different things. So whiteness is just like a belief system on a hierarchy of who has the right to space, right? And so I'm going to pause because I'm mangling this definition. And so let me step back. So there's whiteness is saying there's only one way to behave or interact in this organization, and some of those show up in called dominant culture behaviors. You'll hear the word like perfection, or the sense of doing it yourself. And this is just another framework that we covered in the beginning that your organization can choose to shift your culture. But what we're saying is, how do you use your equity plan and your metrics to make more room for other ways of being? There's this the unknown, like how we currently operate as professionals, that is very limiting and favors white people, particularly white men, but white women very much so are privileged by this current culture in the organizations. And so we're saying, how do you open it up and say that culture is present, but also other ways of being and interacting are allowed in this organization, centered in this organization, and can contribute to this organization. You're not punished because you don't interact one way. So Robin, I just want to know if you wanted to add a little bit more to that, what you meant by whiteness.
Yeah, and I agree with you around whiteness connecting to a certain set of behaviors, and that when whiteness or dominant culture is the only way that, you know, it's seen in a narrow view as the right way, the most professional way of being, we lose out on, again, the myriad of ways that folks can show up and contribute meaningfully to our organizations, our missions, our bottom line, what have you. And I will say that even something as simple as time orientation, you can have a whiteness time orientation, and that doesn't mean necessarily that you are white in order to operate in that way or value that way of operating. And so I'll just differentiate between, again, white people and whiteness as a behavior that we're describing.
So one thing we also are hearing about from the participants on this webinar is, how do you manage the tension when there's conflict on different points of view on what equity looks like? So Steve, like in your picture, you had your vision in your program, and then you have your readiness metrics. Everyone understands, how do I connect and have prosperity in Portland with my department? How do I have an inclusive workplace in my organization? And then what does that mean for my department? How do you help? Like, what is the capacity when there's disagreement to figure out, like, what is that first step, or what are the action areas for a specific department? Have you had any disagreement on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, that's where the opportunity lies, right? And so one of the things that Jane mentioned is, it's not just building a program from anywhere. What do you ground your program and have a discussion around that grounding? And for me and for us at the Port of Portland, the first thing that we did is we were going to center our program and the policies that we wrote on racial equity, right? So then you have a discussion, including your leadership, like what is racial equity? How does racial equity, diversity, and inclusion relate to our vision, our mission, our values, and who we want to be, right? So that is the ground. That's what your strategy should be built upon within your program. right? And then you start doing the work around grounding your program, right, on these concepts. And just start with one, racial equity. I mean, we are still educating on just that concept. What is racial equity, and does racial equity mean you are excluding white people? What about people here, right? The intersectional stuff, right? And to me, that's where the opportunity was. And so one of the questions we had over here is, so how do you even get leadership by, right? Because some leaders at the port understood what that concept meant, right? But it wasn't properly unpacked. So one of the things that I did was, I'm like, you know what? There's a number of agencies, both in the private and public sector, doing this work. Why don't we bring them also? I took my leadership team and I said, here are these people that have already walked 5 years in this journey. Talk to them about this concept and then come back to me once you've landed somewhere to see whether we need to shift where to ground our program, right? Because if they weren't ready, right, to ground the program on racial equity, then my goal would have been 5 years from now to ground the program in racial equity. So not having that then would have been a goal for me as the program manager to say, by 5 years' time, I want the port to ground this work in the discipline of racial equity, because without racial equity, we can't achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right? So that was on me as the program manager, but lucky enough, they bought into it, and I was like, oh, okay, so let me write the policy now. So we wrote the policy, and we also, so you just also have to use all these strategies. Like, your leaders have people that they listen to and people that defer. So you as the implementer need to do some finding out, like, who do my leaders listen to? Who do they defer to? Some of those people could be internal and some of those people could be external. But guess what? That coalition of your willing as well can be some of those people that are forcing your leadership to move, because your leadership does not want to see like they're being left behind by their own employees. So you have to find out how to leverage your tangible and intangible resources. And sorry, I use the word resources. I was talking to people about people, but you know what I mean. So you have to see, what you have to move the work.
I think
Right?
that's another important nugget you're just sharing that's similar to what Robin is saying, like understand what moves your leaders. If it's not, in addition to your conversations to understand, it's what peer exchanges can have. How could you look to other industries to see how equity is being shifted? And I just also want to name, we're interchanging equity and racial equity and social equity. And for this webinar, there's no right answer. Every organization comes at equity at a different way. So, and the term intersectionality means there's just multiple lenses we need to consider. So organizations leading with racial equity lead with race because it's the biggest indicator of disparities. And so you lead with race, knowing that other identities will benefit from that. And so Stephen used the term intersectionality. So saying at the intersection of race, you also see what happens around the woman's experience in being a woman, or the experience of being a parent. And so it's just another way and another analysis that we covered in the slide before. And so when you're the equity manager leading this work, how do the two of you hold the focus of what equity means at that moment for your organization, knowing that there's a lot of definitions to equity, or a lot of ways equity can be focused? So how do you focus the organization while still having your goals, but where are you right now and how are you advancing equity in the context you're currently in?
I think I heard your question one way the first time and then a different way the second time. Can you repeat your question, Amber?
Yeah, so I'm acknowledging we're using a lot of terms around, we're saying equity, then we said social equity, and then we said racial equity. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of ways to describe equity, but they mean they have different focuses. Or with racial equity on race, social equity can mean economically, it can mean class. And so when there's different terms, and as your staff grow in their knowledge, how do you hold your organization to its definition of equity in moving forward and not getting confused or attached to one version of equity?
I think my approach is around consistently bringing it to the forefront, and holding where intersectionality is at play. So I think what I find is that folks often want to make sure that, you know, the group they identify with is not missed in whatever the equity movement or equity commitment is. And so how do you hold folks surfacing, you know, fears, concerns, often justified that they're going to be overseen, even again in our commitment to advancing equity. And so what I try to do is build, once I understand an organization's stance and how they're viewing equity, consistently bringing that in. But in the same way we bring in other common language and frameworks and build on our foundational knowledge, bringing in and stretching our ability to encompass other forms of equity. And if an organization, and right now I'm thinking of back more when I was a consultant, as I was kind of hopping around to different organizations, consistently bringing in that foundational, whatever the organization had initially stated as its form of equity that it was really committed to and felt good about and understood, and then consistently stretching and building. And then for me, probably annually revisiting, and maybe earlier than that, just depending on appetite, exploring and testing for expanding that ability around. So even if an organization was really committed around racial equity, so if I'm bringing in racial equity consistently into our conversations and reminding us, we bring in economic equity, if we start bringing intersectional forms of equity, bringing in that same level of consistency around common language, and then checking at some point for, are we willing as an organization to stretch our holding and understanding of that, of our newer version of equity, or are we still at this foundational level, which is okay, that we can still build on? So it feels like this expanding and contracting exercise that I think is just ongoing. I think we need to always remember the advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, all three, it's an ongoing progression. We're never going to cross the finish line. There's always more work to be done. There's always more learning for us to do. There's always more heart, mind, culture shifts, policies, and practices to attend to. And so if we keep our learning and don't get to the place of we have to land our static commitment around equity, I feel we can often navigate that misconception.
No, I appreciate you bringing that in, and it reminds me of the importance of we and making sure people are feeling called in to how the organization is changing, and the importance of having that common language and making sure everyone's understands, and then just checking in. There's that relational part, checking in. Are we ready now, or do we need to wait later? And it's that attachment to what could we do right now versus what it has to look like. And so giving yourself the freedom. So just want to, that is another like lesson lifting up as your organization is learning and expanding, as Robin was saying, from your initial understanding of equity, is to continue to check in. What do these terms mean to us now? And how is everyone feeling? To make sure everyone, like everyone, that coalition of the willing is bigger and bigger, that it's the organization of the willing, right? And that's because of the communication and calling people in and asking, hey, what does this term mean to you? What perspectives? I really love that you brought that in, Robin. Like, do you see yourself in this analysis? Is there an identity missing? And so that's just an important piece as a lesson learned. There's the framing of why you're doing the work and the areas your organization can have influence on staff, individuals, and communities, but really building that capacity that each department or groups of people see where in their daily work or in their function of the organization, what can they do to contribute, and then figuring out how do we interact with each other? What is that language we want to use when there's a disagreement? What document do we go back to? What social agreement do we have? So when we're ready to expand, or even if we're ready to get sharper at the version of equity you're employing, is everyone's with you and sees their role. So that really is important in the capacity of maintaining the organization, implementing each strategy you've already outlined. So I just want to name, we have 5 minutes left, and it's been super exciting. And I think it'd be great if we just end on a hopeful note. Like, what makes you hopeful? And what are you looking forward to?
Amber, before I go there, I think if there's some folks attending that are part of the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, one of the framework that GARE has is the idea of normalizing, operationalizing concepts, right? So for me, that is part of your program implementation. You have to normalize and operationalize these concepts. And you also have to look at them again in terms of outcome. What concepts do you introduce to start using now? And what concepts can you start using in your third year of your program, right? And then how do you begin to work to normalize those concepts, right? It's like, yeah, you know, in some folks, you can just drop dominant culture or white supremacy kind of society and they'll take it. But in other contexts, you just have to check yourself, right? It's just like, okay, right? So that just has to be part of your contextual program design and implementation. So it's like, okay, how do we normalize this language? What kind of language do we begin with? And then you work that as part of your implementation plan.
And I love that. It really gets to what's your intention of introducing these terms? Is the intention to call people in and see how we can push equity or find our general understanding? Or is your intention just to be harmful? And that's something we didn't get to talk about, but like, what is the intention of introducing these terms? And do you need them in order to do the work? Right. And so there's just really under that discipline and control of the journey, that road that we had. Just because certain terminology or certain strategies that you're seeing other industries doing are implementing them at this moment, doesn't mean it's right for your organization. And so that's what I'm really hearing as a lesson learned from Robin and Steve, is really hearing your organization. Where are they at? Where are you at as the person driving the work? And what is necessary in this moment to move a little bit further on your journey? So we have 2 minutes. So I was wondering, one more time, if we can end on something hopeful. This sounds like it's a lot of work and a lot of focus, but also there's a hopeful side to this work. So if you could just share in a minute, what makes you hopeful about this work?
Steve, do you want to go first, or you want me to go?
1 minute, Steve. 1 minute.
Okay. To me, what has amazingly been hopeful is that at first I was the one in my organization that would constantly bring up the equity question. I don't have to anymore. Like, people are saying it and I get goosebumps, right? And I'm like, you just put equity and empathy in the same sentence. I'm hopeful for the work.
Robin?
That's so concise. Okay, what gives me hope? Actually, I think my older sister, Cheney, she taught me when I was younger about if you have a long way to run, her strategy is to, let's say you're running for the top of the hill where there's a light post. You look at the light post and then you put your head down and you just run as hard as you can. And then maybe a little ways later, you look up again and see your progress. I actually find moments like these that allow me to come up from kind of a head down mentality within my organization to reach out and see there's a larger movement, there's a larger community across the country and really across the world who's committed to the advancement of this work and to achieving a more socially just society. Again, whatever angle you're coming at, if our commitment is towards justice, we're going to have to surface all of the levels and all of the angles. And I find a lot of hope in that, because before, where it felt like a very isolated few, I feel like there's been a real growth and depth of our larger community and what this work looks like. And so I'm just deeply appreciative and find hope in spaces like these.
I just thank both of you for this webinar and like willing to go there with and be vulnerable and share like how you're navigating it. And my hope is in that we had this conversation and that we had people listening and that we're open, and it's and we'll send out resources to how to keep it going. My hopefulness is that we're going to talk again and that we'll see you. So thank you again. I know we went over by a minute, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Amber. Thanks, Steve. Safe,
Thank you,
Daniel.
Bob.